Your role has been eliminated, effective immediately. Please surrender all company property by end of business tomorrow. I read the email 3 times, sitting in the dim glow of my home office at 3:07 in the morning. The oak desk beneath my elbows had been in my family for 2 generations. It felt more solid than anything else in my life at that moment. My CEO's words glowed on the screen of the company-issued laptop I was about to lose. 14 years of my life reduced to 2 sentences and a signature line. I didn't cry. I didn't slam the laptop shut. I just typed back slowly. Carefully. Received. Thank you. Then I closed the lid, poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, and smiled for the first time in 6 months. Because Richard, my brilliant CEO, had just made the single biggest strategic mistake of his entire career, and he was going to find out exactly what that meant in about 6 hours. I read that email a 4th time before I closed the laptop. It arrived at 3:07 am Eastern, and the timing wasn't sloppy. It was surgical. My equity vesting window opened in exactly 4 days. $2, $3 million in stock options, earned over 14 years of building the finance department from a 2-person shop into a globally recognized operation. Richard had timed the termination to cut me off from that payout by 96 hours. It was a textbook attempt at wrongful termination in bad faith, a blatant breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing that any first-year employment attorney could shred in court. But Richard, 52, 6-figure golf memberships, and a Harvard MBA framed above his credenza, apparently thought I was too tired or too loyal to notice. I locked the laptop screen, walked upstairs, and slept for 6 straight hours. For the first time in a year. To understand how a Tuesday morning termination email became the beginning of the best week of my life, we have to rewind a bit. My name is Michael. I'm 51 years old, and for the last 14 years, I have served as the Chief Financial Officer of Aldbrook Meridian, a mid-cap industrial services company headquartered in Chicago. I built that finance function from nothing. When I started, we were doing $180 million in annual revenue. By this year, we were closing on $2.1 billion. I designed the tax structure. I built the compliance architecture across 3 international jurisdictions, and I personally negotiated every major acquisition in the company's history. I know where every dollar lives, where every liability sleeps, and, more importantly, where every skeleton is buried. I know because I helped bury a few of them, always legally, always with proper disclosure, but always with a specific paper trail that only I knew how to follow. I am also a husband and a father. My wife Diane, 49, is a pediatric oncologist. My son Ethan is 17 and starting his senior year of high school. My daughter Maya is 14, and she has been asking for a horse since she could talk. Diane and I have always split the load, but for the past 3 years, that load had tilted heavily toward her. Richard's schedule demanded I be in the office by 6:30 am and often didn't release me before 9 p.m. I missed Ethan's first varsity game. I missed Maya's science fair twice. I told myself the sacrifice was temporary, that once the pending merger closed, I could finally exhale and reclaim my family. Then came Richard. Richard was 52, promoted to CEO 4 years ago by a board that valued charisma over competence. Richard was the kind of executive who could sell ice to a polar bear in January but couldn't read a balance sheet if you highlighted the totals in yellow. His entire career had been built on inheriting functioning systems and taking credit when they ran well. When they broke, he found someone below him to blame. In his 4 years as CEO, he had cycled through 3 chief operating officers, 2 general counsels, and a chief marketing officer who quit via a LinkedIn post that went semi-viral in industry circles. I was the last remaining member of the original executive team. The last person in the C-suite who remembered what the company looked like before Richard's ego took the wheel. The friction between us had been building for 18 months. It sharpened into something dangerous when I refused to sign off on a set of Q2 projections that Richard wanted to present to the board. The numbers he wanted were fantasy. They assumed a 22% margin expansion in a division that was actively contracting. Presenting those figures to the board would have exposed the company to material misrepresentation claims under Sarbanes-Oxley, and worse, it would have painted a false picture for the two suitors who had recently expressed interest in acquiring us. I told Richard, in a closed-door meeting, that I would not attach my signature to any document containing those projections. He stared at me across his glass desk for a long moment. Then he smiled, told me he appreciated my caution, and pivoted to another topic. I should have known right then. That was the moment he decided to get rid of me. He just needed the timing to work in his favor. The timing arrived in the form of Kinsley Barrington, a Fortune 500 industrial conglomerate based out of London. Kinsley had approached us in March about a friendly acquisition. The proposed valuation was $4.8 billion. Richard was going to walk away with a payout north of $60 million if the deal closed. My equity, vesting on schedule, would net me $2.3 million. Small change compared to Richard's number, but life-changing money for my family. Enough to fully fund Ethan's college, Maya's college, buy that horse, pay off the mortgage on our house in Evanston, and let Diane finally cut back to 4 days a week at the hospital. I had earned every dollar of it, through 14 years of skipped dinners, canceled vacations, and 70-hour weeks. Richard, apparently, didn't see it that way. Firing me 4 days before vesting would save the company $2.3 million in equity distribution. That $2.3 million would flow back into the equity pool, and a chunk of it would land in Richard's own compensation package as retention bonus, given his role in shepherding the deal to close. He was, effectively, going to steal my payout by pressing send on a 3am email. It was breathtakingly petty for a man about to become a 9-figure millionaire. It was also, and this is the part that made me smile at my desk with the bourbon in my hand, absolutely, catastrophically stupid. Because Richard had made one small oversight. He had forgotten who actually built the merger's tax structure. He had forgotten that, in exactly 72 hours, Kinsley's legal team would arrive for the final compliance review before signing. And he had forgotten, or perhaps never understood in the first place, that the tri-jurisdictional tax framework I had personally engineered was the single mechanism that made the $4.8 billion valuation possible. Without it, the deal was worth $3.1 billion at most. I slept better that night than I had in 3 years. When the alarm went off at 8 a.m., I got up, made coffee, and sat with Diane at the kitchen table like a normal human being. I told her what happened. I watched her face cycle through shock, then rage, then something quieter and more calculating. Diane is a pediatric oncologist. She has spent 20 years delivering the worst possible news to families in the worst possible moments. Nothing rattles her. She listened to the full story, took a long sip of coffee, and asked one question. Who else at Aldbrook knows the Kinsley tax structure well enough to defend it under diligence? I looked at her for a long moment. Then I smiled. Nobody. Diane. Not a single person. She set down her coffee cup. Then you don't need a lawyer today, Michael. You need a plan for what happens at 9 a.m. My wife is the smartest person I have ever met. I showered, put on a suit, and drove to my office. Not Aldbrook Meridian's office. My personal office. The small workspace I rented in a co-working building 3 blocks from home, where I kept my private files, my personal legal correspondence, and, most importantly, a locked steel filing cabinet containing physical paper copies of every material document I had touched over the past 14 years. I am old school. I trust paper more than I trust servers, and I have kept a running personal archive of the merger work papers since Kinsley first walked in the door. It was, technically, entirely my property. Every document had been generated on my personal encrypted drive, exported and printed on my own equipment, on my own time, and stored in a facility I paid for out of my own pocket. Corporate had never even known that office existed. I unlocked the cabinet, pulled out a thick manila folder, and set it on the desk. The label on the tab, written in my own handwriting, reads simply, Kinsley, Tax Anomalies, May Review. Inside that folder were 3 documents. 3 quiet, boring-looking spreadsheets that any casual observer would file under routine variance analysis. But those 3 spreadsheets, taken together, mapped out 3 specific compliance discrepancies I had identified in early May during my final internal audit before the deal closed. Not fraud. Not fabricated numbers. Just 3 legitimate structural gaps in the way our subsidiary revenue was allocated across the UK, Ireland, and the Cayman Islands. Gaps that, if left unaddressed, would either collapse the tax efficiency of the merger or expose Albrook Meridian to substantial retroactive liability with Merck and the ears. Fixing them was straightforward, a matter of restructuring 2 internal transfer pricing agreements and refiling a specific set of forms with 2 jurisdictions. I had planned to fix them the week after the deal closed, ensuring the shareholder value was protected and the transition was clean. Richard didn't know about the folder. Richard didn't know about the discrepancies. Richard had over the past 18 months systematically stopped reading the detailed compliance memos I sent him, preferring instead the 1-page executive summaries where I flagged nothing that would require him to think. He had trained me, essentially, to protect him from information. And now that information was sitting in a manila folder in my personal office, and it was worth, conservatively, somewhere between $700 million and $1.2 billion, depending on how the diligence unfolded. I sat down at the desk, opened my personal laptop, and drafted 3 emails. The first email was to my personal attorney, a woman named Beatrix Halloran, who had handled my estate work for years and who happened to also be one of the most feared employment litigators in Illinois. I gave her a full summary of the termination email, the timing relative to my vesting, the prior refusal to sign off on Q2 projections, and my recommendation that we should not act publicly for at least 6 hours. She responded within 9 minutes. Understood. Do not contact Aldbrook. Do not respond to Richard. Do not delete anything. Save every email. I will begin drafting the demand letter, but we hold until you say go. You are sitting on a very strong hand. Michael, play it slowly. The second email was to a man named Thomas Waverley, an executive recruiter I had known casually for a decade. Thomas placed CFOs at mid-cap and large-cap industrials across the Midwest. I did not ask him for a job. I asked him a single question. If I were available on the market today, hypothetically, who would you say is the most aggressive current bidder in our specific vertical? Thomas responded in 7 minutes. Off the record, Michael, Fenwick Industrial Group has been trying to poach an experienced CFO for 6 months. They just lost a major bid to Aldbrook in April, and their board is furious. If you are actually available, I can have their chairman on the phone with you inside of an hour. Just say the word. I told him to please make the call. Then I told him not to mention Aldbrook by name. The third email was to Diane, and it contained only 2 words. It's working. At 8:52 am, my personal cell phone rang. The number was blocked, which was standard for Aldbrook's internal executive lines. I let it ring 3 times, then answered with a neutral, "This is Michael." The voice on the other end belonged to Preston Ashworth, our interim chief operating officer and Richard's chief loyalist. Preston was 44, ambitious, and had been angling for my job for 2 years, which is likely why Richard felt confident he had a warm body to slide into the CFO chair the moment I was gone. Preston's voice was tight. "Michael, hey, I know this is awkward given, well, the situation, but we have a small procedural question about the Kinsley diligence packet. Their legal team is asking for a walkthrough of the Q3 tri-jurisdictional reconciliation. Can you point me to the master file?" I paused for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to let the silence become uncomfortable. Then I said, calmly, "Preston, I was terminated at 3:07 this morning, effective immediately, per Richard's email. Under the terms of that termination, I no longer have any authority to discuss internal financial matters, and any assistance I provide could expose both of us to liability. I would suggest you route your question through Richard, since he authorized the transition." Preston made a small, strangled noise. "Michael, come on, we just need a pointer. 5 minutes." I said, "I wish I could help. I really do. Have a good day, Preston." Then I hung up. I stared at the phone for a moment. Then I set a small kitchen timer on my desk for 45 minutes. Because I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Preston was going to walk down the hall to Richard's office, and Richard was going to spend the next 30 minutes trying to bluff his way through a problem he did not understand. The kitchen timer buzzed at 9:38 am. My phone rang exactly 2 minutes later. This time it was Richard's direct line. I let it ring 4 times. Then I let it go to voicemail. I did the same thing the second time he called. And the third. By 10:15, Richard had left 3 voicemails, each one progressively less professional than the last. The first was clipped and businesslike. "Michael, call me back. We have a situation with the Kinsley team. We need to talk immediately." The second was strained. "Michael, this is Richard. Please pick up the phone. This is time sensitive." The third was pure panic dressed in a bad suit. "Michael, I don't know what you're playing at, but Kinsley's lead counsel just walked out of the conference room and said they need Q3 reviewed and reconciled by end of business today, or they are walking away from the deal. Call me back, or I swear to God I will personally make sure you never work in this industry again." I saved all 3 voicemails. I forwarded them, unedited, to Beatrix. Then I made myself a second cup of coffee and waited. At 11:07 am, my phone rang again. This time the caller ID displayed a name I had not expected quite so soon. Owen Whitcomb, chairman of the Aldbrook Meridian Board of Directors. Owen was 68, a retired investment banker who had chaired our board for the past decade. He and I had a professional relationship that had, over the years, warmed into something close to friendship. We had shared bourbon at company retreats. He had asked my advice on his own family estate planning. He was not a stupid man, and he was not a man who called anyone on his personal cell phone unless the situation was very serious. I answered on the second ring. "Owen, good morning." His voice was even, but I could hear the tightness underneath. "Michael, I've just spent the last 40 minutes on a call with Kinsley's chief acquisition counsel, a very unhappy man named Julian Prescott. He is telling me that the diligence process has been effectively halted because the only person who understands our tax structure has, quote, gone dark." Then I called Richard, who is currently locked in a conference room with our general counsel and is refusing to explain why he terminated you at 3 and the same week we are supposed to close a $4.8 billion transaction. So I am calling you directly, Michael, because I have known you for 14 years, and I would like you to tell me, in plain English, what in God's name is happening. I took a slow breath. Owen, I appreciate the call. Before I say anything, I need to make clear that I was terminated at 3:07 this morning by Richard, in writing, effective immediately, and I have already retained legal counsel. Anything I say to you from this point forward will be documented and will be considered relevant to that legal matter. Do you still want me to continue? There was a pause. Then Owen said, "Yes, please continue." The termination was structured to occur exactly 96 hours before my equity vesting window opens. It was a deliberate act of bad faith to withhold approximately $2.3 million in earned compensation. In addition, I refused in June to sign off on Q2 projections that Richard wanted to present to the board because those projections materially overstated margin performance in the industrial coatings division. I believe that refusal was the underlying motivation for today's termination. The silence on the other end of the line lasted a full 7 seconds. When Owen spoke again, his voice had shifted. It was no longer the voice of a man managing a crisis. It was the voice of a man who had just realized the crisis was in fact something else entirely. Michael, I need you to hold on that thought for a moment. Are you telling me that you flagged material projection errors to Richard in June, and I, as chairman of this board, was never informed of that concern? I said, Owen, I sent the memo to Richard on June 14th. I have a copy on my personal server, time-stamped. It was addressed to Richard as CEO, and specifically requested that he include the board audit committee in the review process. I have no record that he ever forwarded it. Another long pause. Then Owen said, "Very carefully, Michael, I would like you to send me that memo. And I would like you to come to a meeting at the offices of Cravath, Coleman and Bell at 2 p.m. this afternoon. Bring your attorney. This is no longer just about your termination. Do you understand what I am saying to you?" I said, "Yes, Owen. I understand exactly what you are saying." He said, "Good. I'll see you at 2. Then he hung up. I sat at my desk for a moment, breathing slowly. Beatrix had told me to play the hand slowly. What she had not told me, because she did not yet know, was that the hand was actually much stronger than either of us had realized at 3 a.m. Richard had not simply tried to steal my $2.3 million equity payout. Richard had, by his own action, exposed a much larger and much more damaging pattern of executive misconduct. And he had done it in front of a board chairman who was now personally on the hook for whatever the SEC and Kinsley's lawyers eventually uncovered. Owen's fiduciary duty had just collided with Owen's personal legal exposure. And in that collision, my leverage had multiplied by a factor of 10. I called Beatrix and briefed her on the conversation. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Michael, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not go to that meeting yet. First, I want you to make one more call. I want you to call Thomas Waverly back and confirm the Fenwick meeting. Get in your car, drive to Fenwick's offices, sit in their lobby. Do not sign anything, do not accept anything, but be physically present in that building at 1:30 p.m. Then I want you to walk out at 1:45, get in your car, and drive directly to the Cravath meeting. When Owen asks where you were, you will tell him, honestly and calmly, that you were exploring alternative employment opportunities because you had been terminated that morning and had a family to support. Do you understand?" I understood perfectly. Beatrix was not just building a legal case. She was building the perception of urgency and irreversibility. She was making sure that when I sat down across from Owen at 2 p.m., he would know, without being told directly, that I already had one foot out the door and into the office of a direct competitor. She was creating the appearance of a ticking clock. And the appearance of a ticking clock, in the middle of a $4.8 billion acquisition where I was the only person alive who could defend the tax structure, was worth more than any legal argument she could make in a courtroom. I called Thomas. I confirmed the meeting. Then I picked up the manila folder and drove north. Fenwick Industrial Group operated out of a 22-story glass tower in the West Loop. I arrived at 1:28 p.m., gave my name to the security desk, and was escorted to the executive floor. Their chairman, a man named Whitfield Prosper, 71, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, met me in the reception area personally. He shook my hand and said, "Michael, Thomas tells me you might be available. I want you to know that we have been trying to solve a very specific problem for 6 months, and I believe you may be exactly the person to solve it. Come with me." He led me to a corner office with a view of the river. He offered me coffee. I declined politely. He asked me 2 questions. The first was, "How quickly could you begin?" I told him, "That depends on the terms and on the resolution of certain outstanding matters with my prior employer." He nodded, unsurprised. The second question was more direct. "Michael, without asking you to disclose anything confidential, would you be able to help us build a merger and acquisition strategy that could, hypothetically, position Fenwick to compete for assets currently in play in our industrial vertical?" I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "Whitfield, I am not going to answer that question today. But I will tell you that I am scheduled for a meeting at 2 p.m. downtown with the chairman of my former board. Depending on how that meeting unfolds, I may or may not be in a position to have a more detailed conversation with you later this week. I would appreciate it if we could leave that door open." Whitfield Prosper smiled. It was the smile of a man who had spent 45 years reading rooms and who had just read this one perfectly. "The door will remain open, Michael, and whatever happens at your 2 p.m. I want you to know that Fenwick's offer to you does not require you to bring anything from your prior employer other than yourself and your expertise. We are not asking for information. We are asking for judgment. That is what we would be paying for." I shook his hand, thanked him, and walked out of the building at 1:44 p.m. As I stepped through the revolving doors onto the sidewalk, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass. I looked, for the first time in years, like a man who owned his own life. I drove downtown. I parked in the underground garage at Cravath, Coleman, and Bell. I rode the elevator to the 34th floor. Beatrix was already waiting in the lobby, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. She kissed me on the cheek in the way old friends do, then said quietly, "Owen is already in the conference room. Richard is not present. General Counsel is present." Also present is a senior partner from Cravath named Aldous Bellingham, who I happen to know personally. Aldous is here because the board needs independent counsel, meaning Owen has already effectively separated himself from Richard's legal defense. This is very good for us. Follow my lead. Say nothing unless I ask you to speak. Do you understand? I nodded. We walked into the conference room. Owen was seated at the head of a long walnut table. To his right was our general counsel, a nervous man named Cyrus Pemberton who had never liked me and who was now, visibly, sweating through his shirt collar. To Owen's left sat Aldous Bellingham. Owen stood as we entered. "Michael, thank you for coming. Please sit." I took the chair directly across from Owen. Beatrix sat beside me and placed a single legal pad on the table. She did not open her briefcase. She did not remove any documents. She simply folded her hands and waited. Owen looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. Michael, before we begin, I want you to know that as of 12:45 this afternoon, the board convened an emergency executive session by phone. In that session, Richard was placed on immediate administrative leave pending an independent investigation into his conduct related to your termination and to the Q2 projection matter you raised earlier today. Preston Ashworth has been directed not to speak with Kinsley's counsel until further notice. The board has retained Cravath as independent counsel. Mr. Bellingham will be leading the investigation. I nodded slowly. I did not smile. Beatrix had told me very specifically not to smile. Owen continued. Now, Michael, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Your attorney is present and can advise you at any point. First question. Do you believe, in your professional judgment as former CFO of this company, that the Kinsley transaction can close on its current timeline without your direct involvement? Beatrix nodded to me almost imperceptibly. I answered. Owen, in my professional judgment, no. The tri-jurisdictional tax structure supporting the Kinsley valuation was designed by me over a period of approximately 14 months. There are 3 subsidiary entities whose transfer pricing arrangements depend on documentation and rationale that exists nowhere in written form except in my personal working notes. Without those notes, and without my ability to explain them in real time to Kinsley's counsel, the tax efficiency of the deal collapses, and the valuation drops accordingly. Owen said, by how much? I said, conservatively, between $700 million and $1.2 billion. The room went very quiet. Cyrus Pemberton made a small choking sound. Aldous Bellingham wrote something down on his own legal pad. Owen closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. Michael, second question. In your capacity as CFO, did you become aware of any specific compliance discrepancies related to the Kinsley transaction that were not disclosed to the board or to Kinsley's diligence team? Beatrix touched my elbow lightly. It was our signal. I answered carefully. Owen, I am not going to answer that question directly at this time. I will say that during my final internal audit in early May, I identified certain structural items that I had planned to address in the week following the deal close. Those items are documented in my personal working files. They are not, at this moment, part of the Kinsley diligence packet. Owen leaned back in his chair. He looked at Aldous. Aldous nodded once. Very slightly. Owen looked back at me. Michael, I am going to be very direct with you now, because I believe we understand each other. This board has a problem, and you are, at this moment, the only person who can help us solve it. I would like to know what it will take to obtain your full cooperation in resolving the Kinsley transaction on its original timeline. I would like your attorney to answer that question on your behalf. Beatrix opened her legal pad, she uncapped her pen. She looked directly at Owen Whitcomb, and then she smiled for the first time since we had entered the room. Owen, thank you for the directness. I will match it. Michael's demands are as follows, and they are non-negotiable. First, immediate reinstatement of the full $2, $3 million equity vesting, backdated to the original schedule, with all shares issued as if the termination had not occurred. Second, a separation payment equal to 40% of the base equity amount, in cash, wired to Michael's personal account within 72 hours. That figure is $920,000. Third, a full mutual release, drafted by Cravath, in which the company acknowledges that the termination was without cause and unrelated to any performance or conduct issue on Michael's part. Fourth, a neutral reference letter, signed by you personally as chairman, characterizing Michael's tenure in a manner consistent with his actual contributions to the company. Fifth, a consulting agreement, effective immediately upon signing, under which Michael will provide up to 40 hours of advisory services to the company between now and the close of the Kinsley transaction. Billed at a rate of $2,500 per hour with a guaranteed minimum of $100,000. Beatrix paused, then continued. There is also a sixth item, and I want to be very careful in how I phrase this. Michael identified certain compliance matters in early May that he had planned to remediate in the week following the Kinsley close. Those matters relate to the tri-jurisdictional tax framework and, in my client's professional judgment, must be properly disclosed to Kinsley as part of good faith diligence. Michael is prepared, as part of his consulting engagement, to prepare a detailed disclosure memorandum and to walk Kinsley's counsel through the remediation plan personally. This will preserve the deal value and protect the board from any subsequent claim that material information was withheld. However, if Michael is not engaged as consultant, he will still, in his individual capacity, be required under existing securities regulations to consider whether disclosure to the SEC is appropriate. I trust I do not need to elaborate on the implications of that path. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Aldous Bellingham was writing steadily. Cyrus Pemberton looked as though he might faint. Owen Whitcomb stared at Beatrix. Then he stared at me. Then, slowly, a small, tight smile crossed his face. It was the smile of a man who had just watched a very well-designed trap close on someone who was not in the room. He said, "Ms. Halloran, I appreciate the clarity of your presentation. I would like to consult with Mr. Bellingham for 20 minutes. Would you and your client be willing to wait?" Beatrix said, "Of course, Owen. We will be in the reception area." We stood, walked out, and closed the door behind us. Beatrix led me to a small side conference room, closed that door too, and only then did she allow herself a quiet, satisfied exhale. She looked at me and said, "Michael, in 22 years of practice, I have never seen a client hold a stronger hand in a hostile separation. Owen is going to come back in that room and accept every single term. Watch." I asked her how she knew. She said, "Because the alternative is that his fiduciary duty forces him to disclose to Kinsley that the CEO fired the only person who could defend the deal 4 days before a $2.3 million vesting, and that the same person had previously flagged material misstatement issues that were not escalated." That story ends with Owen being personally sued by shareholders and Kinsley pulling the offer entirely. Owen knows it. Owen came back at exactly the 20-minute mark. He asked us to return to the conference room. He said, "Miss Halloran, Michael, the board accepts all 6 terms as presented. Mr. Bellingham will draft the agreements this afternoon. We would like to have signatures in place by 8 p.m. tonight. The consulting engagement will begin immediately upon signing. Kinsley's counsel has been informed that they will have a full walkthrough of the tri-jurisdictional structure tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., with Michael leading the session in his capacity as consulting advisor. Is that acceptable?" Beatrix looked at me. I nodded. She said, "That is acceptable, Owen." Owen extended his hand across the table. I shook it. He held on for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and he said quietly, "Michael, for what it's worth, I owe you a personal apology. I should have known what Richard was doing sooner. That failure is on me." I said, "Owen, I appreciate that. Let's close the deal." The signatures were finalized at 7:42 p.m. The $920,000 wire hit my personal account 71 hours later. The Kinsley acquisition closed on schedule at $4.8 billion. My equity payout, all $2.3 million of it, was fully vested and distributed within 30 days of closing. Richard was terminated for cause the following Monday, with no severance and no released equity. The independent investigation Aldous Bellingham led uncovered enough additional misconduct that Richard was quietly barred from serving as an officer at any publicly traded company for the following 7 years. Per an SEC settlement he signed to avoid formal charges. The last I heard, he had moved to Arizona and was doing part-time consulting for a firm that specialized in coaching failed executives on their personal brands. I hope, for his sake, that he is very good at it. Fenwick Industrial Group made me a formal offer 3 weeks after the Kinsley close. Chief Financial Officer, full authority over strategy. A compensation package that made my Aldbrook comp look modest. And, most importantly, a written commitment from Whitfield Prosper that I would report directly to the board on a quarterly cadence, with the audit committee, always. In every discussion involving projections, I accepted. Diane cut back to 4 days a week at the hospital. Ethan started at Northwestern in the fall. Maya got her horse, a chestnut mare named Beatrice, which I found quietly appropriate. I paid off the mortgage on the house in Evanston with a single wire. And for the first time in 14 years, I ate dinner at my own kitchen table 5 nights a week. I think about that Tuesday morning sometimes. About Richard, sitting in his corner office at 3 a.m., drafting a 2-sentence email that he believed was the smartest move of his career. About how confident he must have felt when he hit send. About how utterly certain he was that his authority and his position and his corner office made him untouchable. He was not wrong that power exists in corporate hierarchies. He was wrong about where his own power came from. His power came from the people below him, who quietly kept his mistakes from becoming visible. The moment he decided to punish one of those people for refusing to lie, he lost the shield that had been protecting him for 4 years, and when the shield came down, everything he had built came down with it. If this story resonated with you, I would deeply appreciate it if you would take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Drop a comment below and tell me about the moment you finally chose yourself.